Margaret Hayes adjusted her reading glasses and smoothed the crease from the newspaper spread across her kitchen table. At 72, her hands showed the gentle tremor that came with age. But her mind remained sharp as the day she'd graduated valedictorian from nursing school 50 years ago. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains she'd sewn herself, casting delicate patterns across the worn linoleum floor of the modest ranch house she'd called home for 38 years. The house had been her sanctuary once. She and Harold had painted every room together, planted the rose bushes that still bloomed faithfully each spring, and raised their 2 children within these walls. Now, 18 months after Harold's funeral, the house felt different. Not empty exactly, but changed in ways that went deeper than his missing coffee cup on the counter, or the silence where his morning news programs used to play. Margaret folded the newspaper carefully, a habit ingrained from decades of making every dollar stretch. She was preparing to start her morning routine, a cup of chamomile tea followed by a walk around the neighborhood, when she heard her son David's car in the driveway. The engine's familiar rumble was followed by the sharp slam of car doors and the sound of voices already raised in discussion. Through the kitchen window, she watched David and his wife Christine approach the front door, their expressions serious. Behind them, their teenage son Tyler trudged along, earbuds firmly in place, his attention focused on his phone. Margaret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that had become her constant companion whenever her family visited these days. Their visits, once warm and frequent, had become irregular and tense, filled with conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. The front door opened without a knock, a liberty that had once felt natural but now seemed presumptuous. "Mom," David called out, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "In the kitchen, dear," Margaret replied, rising from her chair and smoothing her simple blue dress. She'd learned to dress carefully for their visits. Nothing too expensive looking that might prompt comments about her wasting money. Nothing too casual that might suggest she was letting herself go. David entered the kitchen with Christine close behind, their faces wearing matching expressions of strained patience. At 51, David bore a strong resemblance to his father, though where Harold had carried himself with quiet confidence, David seemed perpetually burdened by responsibilities he resented. Christine, blonde and precisely put together, even on a Saturday morning, offered Margaret a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We need to talk, Mom," David said without preamble, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with a heavy sigh. Christine remained standing, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Margaret's shoulder. Margaret poured herself the tea she'd been preparing, her movements deliberate and calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like some coffee? I have that French roast you like." "This isn't a social call," Christine interjected, her voice sharp. "We've been going over Harold's finances, and there are some things that need to be addressed." Margaret's hands stilled on her teacup. Harold's finances. For 47 years of marriage, Harold had handled their money with the careful attention of a man who'd grown up during the Depression. Every decision had been discussed between them, every dollar accounted for, every investment made with their shared future in mind. Since his death, Margaret had continued managing their affairs with the same meticulous care. But apparently, her competence was now in question. "I see," Margaret said quietly, settling into her chair across from David. "What concerns you?" David pulled out a folder thick with papers and spread them across the table, obscuring Margaret's careful place setting. "These property tax payments, for one thing. You're paying taxes on Dad's workshop and the vacant lot behind the house. That's throwing money away." Margaret nodded slowly. The workshop where Harold had spent countless happy hours building furniture and fixing everything from broken toys to neighbors' lawnmowers. The lot where they'd once planned to build a small guest cottage for visiting grandchildren. "Your father always said those properties would be valuable someday. The town is growing." "Mom, you're not a real estate investor," Christine interrupted. "You're a 72-year-old widow living on a fixed income. You can't afford to hold on to property for sentimental reasons." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and stinging. Margaret took a careful sip of her tea, buying herself time to formulate a response that wouldn't escalate the conversation into an argument. She'd learned that arguments with Christine were battles she could never win, not because she lacked the words or the logic, but because winning would cost her access to her son and grandson. "The taxes aren't a burden," Margaret said carefully. "Your father left me well provided for." David leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's another thing. You're living like you're poor when you're sitting on a substantial nest egg. It doesn't make sense. Margaret blinked in surprise. Since Harold's death, she'd maintained the same careful spending habits that had served them well throughout their marriage. She bought generic groceries, mended clothes rather than replacing them, and found joy in simple pleasures that cost little or nothing. I live comfortably, David. I don't want for anything. You drive a 15-year-old car, Christine said, her tone suggesting this was evidence of mental incapacity. You shop with coupons. You heat one room at a time in the winter. Harold left you enough money to live properly, but you're hoarding it like some kind of— She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from a growing anger she struggled to contain. The habits Christine dismissed as evidence of decline were the same practices that had allowed Harold and Margaret to pay off their mortgage early, put both children through college without debt, and build the financial security that now seemed to offend their daughter. Perhaps we should discuss what you think I should be doing differently, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. David and Christine exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that excluded everyone else in the room. Margaret had shared such looks with Harold, but theirs had been filled with warmth and understanding. This exchange carried the weight of predetermined decisions and coordinated strategy. We think it's time you considered moving into a retirement community, David said, the words rushing out as if speed might soften their impact. Somewhere with activities and medical care available. You'd have people your own age to socialize with. Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. I have friends my age, David. I have this house, this neighborhood. I have a life here. You have isolation, Christine corrected. When was the last time you went anywhere beyond the grocery store and the library? When did you last have a real conversation with someone who isn't a cashier? The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Since Harold's death, Margaret's social circle had indeed contracted. Some friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with her new status as a widow. Others had moved to warmer climates or assisted living facilities. But Margaret had adapted, finding satisfaction in her books, her garden, her quiet routines. I'm content here, Margaret said. This house holds 40 years of memories. Your father and I— Dad's gone, Mom, David said, his voice gentler but no less firm. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring him back. And frankly, maintaining a 3-bedroom house at your age isn't practical. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. My age, you're not getting any younger, Christine said with the bluntness of someone delivering an obvious truth. What happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens when you can't manage the stairs to the basement laundry room? What happens when you get confused about medications or forget to turn off the stove? The scenarios painted a picture of Margaret as a disaster waiting to happen, a burden whose independence was an illusion, maintained only by luck and stubborn denial. Margaret looked at her son, searching his face for some sign that he disagreed with his wife's assessment, but found only resigned agreement. I see, Margaret said quietly, and you've found a suitable place for me. David brightened, apparently interpreting her question as acceptance rather than clarification. There's a really nice facility about 20 minutes from our house, Sunshine Manor. They have different levels of care, so you could start in independent living and transition to assisted care when you need it. The waiting list is usually quite long, Christine added, but they have an opening now if we move quickly. We've already put down a deposit to hold it. Margaret felt the world shift slightly, as if the kitchen floor had developed a barely perceptible tilt. They'd put down a deposit. Without consulting her, without asking her permission, they'd made decisions about her life, her future, her home, and now they were presenting those decisions as a fait accompli wrapped in concern for her welfare. I see, Margaret repeated, the words feeling strange in her mouth. And what would happen to this house? We'd sell it, obviously, Christine said. The real estate market is strong right now. The money would go into your retirement fund, help pay for the facility, along with the money from selling Dad's workshop and the lot, David added. Really, Mom, it makes perfect financial sense. Margaret nodded slowly, her mind working with a clarity that surprised her. They'd thought this through. These two people who'd once been the children she'd rocked to sleep and taught to ride bicycles. They'd calculated her worth, measured her remaining value, and determined that her best use was as a liquid asset to fund her own warehousing. You've given this considerable thought, Margaret said. We have. David confirmed, relief evident in his voice. I know it's a big change, but it's really for the best. You'll be safer, you'll have company, and Christine and I won't have to worry about you rattling around in this big house by yourself. Margaret stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Harold's tomatoes were just beginning to show their first green fruits. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals bright against the white fence Harold had painted the summer before his heart attack. This view had greeted her every morning for 38 years. She'd watched her children play in that yard, hosted birthday parties and holiday gatherings, tended the garden through droughts and storms and seasons of abundance. When would this transition take place? She asked, without turning around. The sooner the better, Christine said. We could start packing your personal items next weekend. The facility is furnished, so you'll only need clothes and keepsakes. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, imagining the reduction of her life to whatever belongings could fit in a single room. The china cabinet that had belonged to Harold's grandmother, the dining room table where they'd shared thousands of meals, the bedroom furniture they'd saved for months to buy as newlyweds. All of it would disappear into estate sales and donation. Trucks, transformed from treasured possessions into obstacles to be cleared away. Mom. David's voice carried a note of uncertainty. You understand this is what needs to happen, right? Margaret turned back to face them, and for a moment they seemed like strangers to her. When had David developed that line of impatience between his eyebrows? When had Christine's mouth settled into its default expression of barely contained irritation? When had their concern for her welfare become indistinguishable from their desire to dispose of an inconvenient responsibility? I understand what you're proposing, Margaret said carefully. I'd like some time to think about it. Christine's composure cracked slightly. There's nothing to think about, Margaret. This isn't a choice between equally good options. This is about facing reality. The use of her first name instead of Mom felt like a small slap, a deliberate distancing that reminded Margaret of her reduced status in the family hierarchy. She was no longer David's mother, deserving of respect and consideration. She was Margaret, an aging problem to be managed efficiently. Nevertheless, Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of steel that surprised all three of them, I'd like some time to consider my options. David started to protest, but something in Margaret's expressions stopped him. For just a moment, he seemed to remember that the woman standing before him had once been the fiercest advocate in his corner, the one who'd fought his battles when he was too small to fight them himself. Of course, he said reluctantly, but don't take too long. That spot at Sunshine Manor won't hold forever. After they left, Margaret sat in her kitchen as the morning light shifted and changed around her. The papers David had spread across her table told a story she'd never heard before. The story of a foolish old woman who didn't understand her own limitations, who clung to a past that was gone and a future that would never come. But Margaret knew a different story. She knew the story of a woman who'd worked as a registered nurse for 30 years, managing life and death decisions with competence and grace. She knew the story of a wife who'd helped build a strong marriage and a secure financial foundation through careful planning and shared sacrifice. She knew the story of a mother who'd raised 2 successful children, though success, she was beginning to understand, didn't always include gratitude or respect. Margaret cleared the papers from her table, folding them neatly and setting them aside. Then she made herself a fresh cup of tea and sat down with the notebook where she kept track of household expenses. For the next hour, she reviewed her finances with the methodical attention she'd learned during her nursing career. Harold had indeed left her well provided for, but Margaret's careful management had made her more than comfortable. It had made her independent. As the afternoon sun slanted through her kitchen windows, Margaret began to understand that independence was exactly what her family found so threatening. The following Tuesday, Margaret found herself sitting across from Dr. Patricia Wells, her physician of 12 years, for what she'd assumed would be a routine checkup. Dr. Wells was a woman Margaret's own age who'd returned to family practice after raising her children, and their appointments usually felt more like conversations between friends than medical consultations. Your blood pressure is excellent, Dr. Wells said, removing the cuff from Margaret's arm, and your blood work from last month showed everything in normal ranges. How are you feeling overall? Quite well, thank you, Margaret replied, though she hesitated before adding, though I confess I've been feeling a bit unsettled lately. Dr. Wells settled into her chair, giving Margaret her full attention. Tell me about that. Margaret found herself describing the conversation with David and Christine. The assumptions about her declining capabilities, the pressure to abandon her home for what they called her own good. As she spoke, she watched Dr. Wells's expression grow increasingly thoughtful. Margaret, Dr. Wells said when she'd finished, I hope you know that from a medical standpoint, there's absolutely nothing about your condition that would prevent you from living independently for many years to come. You're in remarkably good health for 72. I thought so, Margaret said, feeling a small weight lift from her shoulders, but they seem so certain that I'm diminished. Dr. Wells leaned forward slightly. I see this more often than I'd like to admit. Adult children who conflate age with incapacity, who mistake wisdom for confusion and careful financial management for hoarding. It's a form of ageism that's particularly cruel because it comes disguised as caring. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of being understood. I'm not ready to give up my life, Patricia. Then don't, Dr. Wells said firmly. And if anyone questions your mental capacity, you have my full support. Your cognitive function is excellent, your judgment is sound, and your ability to make decisions about your own life is completely intact. Armed with Dr. Wells's reassurance, Margaret spent the rest of the week thinking carefully about her situation. She'd always prided herself on being a practical woman, someone who faced problems head-on, rather than hiding from them. The problem, as she saw it, wasn't her age or her capabilities, it was her family's perception of both. On Friday morning, she called David at his office. I'd like to invite you and Christine for dinner Sunday, she said, when he answered. There are some things I'd like to discuss. Mom, if this is about the retirement community thing, we've already been over this. Please, Margaret interrupted gently. Just dinner. I'll make your favorite pot roast. There was a pause, and Margaret could almost hear David weighing his options. All right, he said finally, but I hope you're ready to be reasonable about this. Margaret spent Saturday preparing for the dinner with the same attention she'd once given to hosting Harold's business colleagues. She cleaned the house until it sparkled, arranged fresh flowers from her garden, and planned a menu that showcased her culinary skills. If David and Christine were determined to see her as a declining old woman, she'd present them with evidence to the contrary. Sunday arrived, crisp and clear, one of those perfect late spring days that made Margaret grateful to be alive. She dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that complemented her silver hair and minimal but elegant jewelry. When David and Christine arrived punctually, as always, Margaret greeted them with the same grace she'd perfected during decades of entertaining. Something smells wonderful, David said, kissing her cheek. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to hope that today might be different, that somehow the atmosphere of home and family tradition might soften whatever hardness had grown between them. Pot roast with those little potatoes you loved as a boy, Margaret said, leading them into the living room. An apple pie for dessert. Christine surveyed the room with the critical eye of someone evaluating real estate. You've certainly kept the place nice, she said in a tone that suggested this was somehow surprising. They settled into Margaret's living room, where she served coffee from her good china and offered homemade cookies she'd baked that morning. For a few minutes, the conversation remained pleasantly neutral. David's work, Tyler's progress in school, the unusually mild weather they'd been having. Then Christine set down her coffee cup with a definitive click. Margaret, we need to talk about practical matters. Time isn't going to stand still while you work through your feelings about leaving this house. Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but this time she was prepared for it. Of course. I've given your suggestion considerable thought. Good, David said, relief evident in his voice. I was hoping you'd come around to seeing reason. I've made some decisions, Margaret continued, her voice steady, but perhaps not the ones you're expecting. Christine's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Margaret rose and walked to the mahogany secretary desk that had belonged to her mother, withdrawing a folder she'd prepared earlier. I've been reviewing my financial situation, as you suggested. You're quite right that I'm in a comfortable position. She returned to her chair and opened the folder, revealing a series of documents she'd organized with characteristic precision. What I discovered is that I'm not just comfortable, I'm quite well off. Harold was an excellent investor, and my own careful management has allowed our assets to grow considerably since his death. David leaned forward, interest replacing impatience. That's wonderful, Mom. It means you can afford a really nice place at Sunshine Manor. Perhaps, Margaret said, but it also means I have other options. She pulled out the first document a letter from her financial advisor detailing her current net worth. The figure was substantial enough to make both David and Christine's eyes widen. Margaret had always known she was financially secure, but seeing the number written in black and white had surprised even her. I've also been researching home care services, Margaret continued, producing another set of papers. For a fraction of what a retirement facility would cost, I could hire someone to help with household tasks, provide companionship, and assist with medical needs if they should arise. I could age in place with dignity and independence. Christine's expression had shifted from confident dismissal to wary attention. Home care isn't the same as having medical professionals available around the clock. No, Margaret agreed, but since I'm in excellent health and have no need for around-the-clock medical care, that seems irrelevant. Dr. Wells has provided me with a letter attesting to my physical and mental fitness. She produced the letter, which Dr. Wells had written, in clear, professional language that left no room for misinterpretation. Margaret Hayes was competent to make her own decisions and capable of living independently for the foreseeable future. David took the letter and read it carefully, his expression growing troubled. Mom, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. What about emergencies? What about ... What about the fact that I'm happy here? Margaret interrupted gently. What about the fact that this is my home, filled with memories and meaning that can't be replicated in an institutional setting? It's not institutional, Christine protested. Sunshine Manor is very nice. They have activities and social programs. I have activities, Margaret said. I have my garden, my reading, my volunteer work at the library. I have friends and routines and a life that brings me satisfaction. She pulled out another document, this one a detailed budget showing how her income could easily support her current lifestyle indefinitely, with enough left over for any care she might eventually need. The truth is, Margaret said, looking directly at her son, that your concern about my welfare seems to be mixed up with concern about your inheritance. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which Margaret supposed they were. David's face flushed red, and Christine's mouth opened in outrage. How dare you suggest, Christine began. I'm not suggesting anything, Margaret said calmly. I'm stating a fact. You want me to sell this house and liquidate Harold's workshop and property so the proceeds can go into paying for institutional care that I don't need. You've presented this as being in my best interest, but I can't see how giving up my independence and happiness serves anyone but yourselves. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's completely unfair, Mom. We're trying to look out for you. By making decisions about my life without consulting me. By putting down deposits on facilities I never agreed to enter. By treating me like an incompetent child who can't be trusted to manage her own affairs. Margaret's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath that both David and Christine could hear. This wasn't the gentle, accommodating woman they'd grown accustomed to managing. We're trying to be responsible, Christine said, her voice tight with anger. Someone has to think about the future, even if you won't. I am thinking about the future, Margaret replied. My future? The years I have left to live in the home I love, surrounded by the things that matter to me. You're thinking about a different future, one where I'm safely warehoused and my assets are preserved for your eventual benefit. That's a horrible thing to say, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. Man saw not the little boy who'd once climbed into her lap for comfort, but a middle-aged man whose love for her had become complicated by resentment and calculation. When had that change happened? When had her value as a person become secondary to her value as an estate to be managed? I love you, David, she said quietly. I love you both, but I won't be bullied into giving up my life to ease your consciences or protect your financial interests. This isn't about money, David said, but the protest sounded hollow even to him. Isn't it? Margaret asked. Then you won't mind that I've decided to make some changes to my will. She produced the final document, one that had required considerable thought and the consultation of Harold's longtime attorney. It was a revised will that established a trust for her care, and specified that the house would become a historical property managed by the local preservation society upon her death. I've ensured that I'll be cared for regardless of my future needs, Margaret explained, but I've also ensured that this house, Harold's house, our family's house, will be preserved rather than sold to developers. Christine snatched the document from Margaret's hands, scanning it quickly. You can't do this. This house should go to David, to your family. I can do whatever I choose with my own property, Margaret said, and I choose to preserve something beautiful rather than let it be torn down for profit. David slumped back into his chair, looking suddenly older than his 51 years. Mom, why are you doing this? Because you've shown me that my wishes and my happiness don't matter to you, Margaret said simply. Because you've treated me like a burden to be disposed of rather than a person to be respected. Because you've forgotten that love isn't just about inheritance, it's about honoring the dignity of the people you claim to care about. The dinner that followed was tense and largely silent. Christine barely touched her food. Her jaw set in a hard line that spoke of barely contained fury. David ate mechanically, glancing occasionally at his mother, as if trying to reconcile this assertive woman with the compliant figure he'd expected to handle. As they prepared to leave, David turned to Margaret with something approaching desperation. We can work this out, Mom. We don't have to let this tear the family apart. Margaret stood in her doorway, looking at the son she'd raised with such hope and pride. The family was torn apart the moment you decided my life was less important than your convenience. But yes, David, we can work this out. When you're ready to treat me as an equal rather than an obligation, we can have a different conversation. After they left, Margaret cleaned up the dinner dishes with a sense of liberation she hadn't felt in months. She'd drawn her lines, established her boundaries, and claimed her right to live her own life on her own terms. The cost might be a relationship with her son and daughter-in-law, but she was beginning to understand that she'd lost that relationship. Anyway, she'd just been too polite to acknowledge it. As she dried the last plate and put it away in the cabinet where it belonged, Margaret smiled. Tomorrow she would call the landscaper about expanding her garden. She would sign up for the art class at the community center she'd been considering. She would start living the life Harold would have wanted for her. Not the diminished existence others thought appropriate for her age, but the full, rich life she deserved. The phone calls started the next morning. The first came from David's sister Susan, who lived 3 states away and had apparently received a carefully edited version of Sunday's dinner conversation. Mom, David says you're being unreasonable about the retirement home, Susan said without preamble when Margaret answered. He's worried about you living alone. Margaret poured herself coffee and settled into her favorite kitchen chair, the one with the cushion she'd embroidered with roses. Hello, Susan. I'm fine. Thank you for asking. How are Mark and the children? Don't change the subject, Susan said, her voice carrying the same impatient edge that had become David's default tone. This isn't about social pleasantries. David says you're refusing help and making changes to your will out of spite. Margaret felt a familiar sadness settle over her. Susan had always been her more difficult child, quick to anger and slow to forgive, but Margaret had hoped that age and motherhood might have softened some of her harder edges. Apparently, that hope had been misplaced. I'm not refusing help, Margaret said calmly. I'm refusing to be placed in an institution I don't need and don't want. Those are very different things. You can't live alone forever, Susan said. What happens when you fall? What happens when you get confused? What happens when I live my life on my own terms until I no longer can? Margaret interrupted. What happens when I maintain my dignity and independence rather than surrendering them preemptively? There was a pause, and Margaret could almost hear Susan calculating her next approach. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on the wheedling tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. Mom, we're your family. We love you. We just want what's best for you. If you love me, Margaret said, then respect my choices. If you want what's best for me, then support my desire to remain in my own home. That's selfish, Susan snapped, her careful tone cracking. Do you have any idea how worried David is? How guilty he feels about you living alone? You're putting an unfair burden on him. Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. I'm putting a burden on him by living independently and managing my own affairs. You're putting a burden on him by refusing to be reasonable about your limitations. What limitations? Margaret asked. I'm in good health, I'm mentally competent, and I'm financially secure. What limitations are you referring to? Susan's voice rose in frustration. You're 72 years old. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I am, and apparently, that's my greatest sin. The conversation deteriorated from there, ending when Susan hung up on her mother in a fit of exasperation. Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long time afterward, watching the morning light shift across her garden and thinking about the children she'd raised to be independent and strong-willed. She'd succeeded, perhaps too well. They'd become so accustomed to making their own decisions that they couldn't imagine why she might want to make hers. The second call came that afternoon from Tyler, her 18-year-old grandson. This conversation was different, tentative, confused, but tinged with genuine affection. "Grandma, Mom says you don't want to move to that old folks' place." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt all day. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you doing?" "I'm okay, I guess. But everyone's all upset about this thing with you. Mom and Dad have been fighting about it all morning." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. Whatever her issues with David and Christine, she didn't want their marriage to suffer because of her decisions. "I'm sorry to hear that, Tyler. That wasn't my intention." "Are you really going to give away the house?" Tyler asked. "Mom says you're leaving it to some museum or something." "I'm ensuring that it's preserved," Margaret said carefully. "This house has been our family's home for almost 40 years. I'd like it to remain beautiful rather than being torn down for a strip mall." There was a long pause. "Could I come see it before you do anything permanent? I mean, I haven't been there since Grandpa's funeral, and I don't really remember it very well." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Of all her family members, Tyler was the only one who seemed to understand that the house itself might have value beyond its monetary worth. "Of course you can visit," she said. "You're welcome here anytime. Maybe this weekend. I could drive down Saturday morning." "I'd love that," Margaret said, and meant it. Tyler's visit provided a bright spot in an otherwise difficult week. He arrived Saturday morning in the battered Honda he'd bought with his summer job earnings, looking like a younger version of his father but with curiosity instead of calculation in his eyes. Margaret gave him the grand tour, showing him the bedroom where his father had grown up, the basement workshop where Harold had built the rocking horse Tyler had ridden as a small child, the garden where 3 generations of the family had planted flowers and vegetables. As they walked, Tyler asked questions that revealed a genuine interest in the family history embedded in every room. "I remember Grandpa teaching me to hammer nails in the workshop," Tyler said, running his hand along Harold's workbench. "He was so patient. I must have bent 100 nails before I got one right." "He loved having you here," Margaret said. "He always said you had good hands, that you understood how things worked." They spent the afternoon looking through photos, albums, Tyler laughing at pictures of his father as a gap-toothed child, and listening with rapt attention as Margaret told stories about the family's history. Over dinner, he surprised her with his directness. "Why do Mom and Dad want you to move out so badly?" he asked. "This place is awesome. If I inherited a house like this, I'd never leave." Margaret considered her answer carefully. "I think they're genuinely worried about me, but I also think they have some misconceptions about what it means to be my age." "Like what?" "Like the idea that turning 72 automatically makes me incapable of making my own decisions or living my own life." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "That's pretty messed up. I mean, you seem more competent than most adults I know." Margaret laughed, delighted by his honesty. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know." As the evening wound down, Tyler helped Margaret clean up the dinner dishes, a simple domestic task that his parents couldn't be bothered with during their visits. As he dried the last plate, he turned to her with an expression of adult seriousness that reminded Margaret of Harold. "Grandma, I want you to know that I think what you're doing is brave. And if you ever need someone on your side, you've got me." Margaret hugged him tightly, this grandson who'd somehow managed to see her as a person rather than a problem. "Thank you, Tyler. That means everything to me." After he left Sunday morning, Margaret felt energized in a way she hadn't in months. Tyler's visit had reminded her that respect and understanding were still possible, that not everyone saw her age as a disqualification from living fully. Monday brought another phone call, this one from David's voice, tight with barely controlled anger. "I can't believe you involved Tyler in this," he said without preamble. "I didn't involve anyone," Margaret replied. "He called me, and then he asked to visit. I said yes. You told him our business. You got him worked up about things that don't concern him." "Our business," Margaret repeated. "David, this is my life we're talking about. My house, my future, my decisions. How is that our business?" "Because we're your family," David shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "Because we're the ones who'll have to deal with the consequences. When you fall down those stairs or forget to turn off the stove or wander out into traffic." Margaret felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "Is that really what you think of me? That I'm one step away from wandering into traffic? I think you're getting older whether you want to admit it or not." David said, his voice calmer, but no less harsh. I think you're being stubborn and selfish, and I think you're putting everyone who loves you in an impossible position. The impossible position of respecting my autonomy. The impossible position of watching you make bad decisions and not being able to stop you. Margaret sat down heavily, feeling every one of her 72 years. David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What, if your father were still alive, would you be having this conversation with him? There was a long pause. That's different. Dad was what? More capable, more intelligent, more deserving of respect. Dad was a man, David said, then immediately seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, he was stronger physically, and he understood business, and I'm just a silly old woman who needs to be managed for her own good. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The conversation ended badly, with David hanging up in frustration, and Margaret sitting in her silent kitchen, understanding with crystalline clarity that her family's concern for her welfare was inseparable from their belief that women of her age were inherently incompetent. That evening, Margaret called her attorney, Richard Morrison, who'd handled the family's legal affairs for over 20 years. She made an appointment for the following week to finalize the arrangements she'd outlined to David and Christine, but also to explore other options she hadn't previously considered. If her family was determined to see her as a burden and an obligation, then perhaps it was time to relieve them of that burden entirely. Richard Morrison's law office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building in the historic district, its tall windows offering views of the tree-lined streets Margaret had walked as a young mother. At 78, Richard was only 6 years older than Margaret, and their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship over the decades. Margaret, Richard said, rising from behind his mahogany desk to greet her. You sounded troubled on the phone. How can I help? Margaret settled into the leather chair across from his desk, her purse held carefully in her lap. I need to understand my options, Richard, all of them. Over the next hour, Margaret laid out the situation with her family, their pressure for her to enter a retirement facility, and her own desire to remain independent. Richard listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. Your current will is perfectly valid, Richard said when she'd finished. And the trust arrangements we discussed for your care are solid, but I sense you're considering additional changes. I am, Margaret said. I want to explore the possibility of legally protecting myself from further interference. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. There are several approaches we could take. A strongly worded advance directive that specifies your preferences for care. A durable power of attorney that designates someone other than your children to make medical and financial decisions if you become incapacitated. We could even establish a revocable trust that gives you complete control during your lifetime but protects your assets from outside pressures. What about changing my emergency contacts? My medical proxy? Perfectly within your rights, Richard assured her. Who did you have in mind? Margaret had been thinking about this question since Tyler's visit. Dr. Wells for medical decisions, you for legal and financial matters, and Tyler as my primary emergency contact. Richard raised an eyebrow. Your grandson. He's quite young. He's 18, legally an adult, and he's the only member of my family who seems to understand that respecting my wishes doesn't require agreeing with all my decisions. I see. Richard made more notes. Margaret, I have to ask, are you certain this is what you want? These changes will effectively remove your children from any decision-making role in your life. Margaret looked out the window at the street below, where people of all ages moved with purpose and autonomy. A woman roughly her own age was tending to the flower boxes outside the bakery, her movements sure and competent despite her white hair and lined face. Richard, let me ask you something. If Harold were still alive and our children were pressuring him to enter a retirement facility against his will, would you advise him to comply? Of course not. Then why should my situation be any different? Richard smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. It shouldn't be, and it won't be, if I have anything to say about it. They spent another hour working through the details of Margaret's new arrangements. By the time she left Richard's office, she'd established a comprehensive framework for protecting her autonomy while ensuring she'd receive appropriate care if her circumstances changed. The changes Margaret made weren't dramatic in themselves, but their cumulative effect was transformative. She updated her medical records to reflect Dr. Wells as her healthcare proxy and Tyler as her emergency contact. She established a trust that would fund in-home care if needed, while preserving her assets according to her wishes. She even arranged for a monthly consultation with a geriatric care manager, who could assess her needs and coordinate services if they became necessary. Most importantly, she began to build a support network that didn't depend on her children's approval or participation. She joined a book club at the library, started taking watercolor classes at the community center, and began volunteering at the local food bank. Each activity brought her into contact with people who saw her as Margaret as intelligent, capable, interesting rather than as David's aging mother or Harold's widow. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. Margaret found herself standing straighter, speaking with more confidence, making decisions without the constant anxiety about family approval that had plagued her since Harold's death. She was reclaiming not just her independence, but her identity. The confrontation she'd been dreading came 3 weeks later. When David and Christine arrived, unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, Margaret saw them through her kitchen window as they approached the house, their expressions grim with purpose. "We need to talk," David announced when Margaret opened the door. "Of course," Margaret said, stepping aside to let them in. "Would you like coffee?" "This isn't a social call," Christine said, echoing her words from their previous visit. "We've been talking to lawyers." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was smaller than before. "More manageable, I see. About what?" "About your mental competency," David said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "About whether you're capable of making rational decisions about your welfare." Margaret moved to the kitchen counter, ostensibly to prepare tea, but actually to give herself time to process this escalation. They were threatening her with legal action, questioning her sanity, treating her like an enemy rather than a family member. "I see," she said quietly, filling the kettle with water. "And what have these lawyers told you?" "That it's possible to petition for guardianship if we can demonstrate that you're not competent to manage your own affairs," Christine said, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Margaret turned to face them, the kettle still in her hands. "And do you believe I'm incompetent, David?" Her son shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. "I think you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. I think you're putting yourself at risk because you're too proud to admit you need help." "What kind of help do I need?" Margaret asked. "Supervision," Christine said bluntly. "Someone to make sure you're eating properly, taking your medications, not leaving the stove on or the door unlocked." Margaret set the kettle on the stove, with deliberate care. "Have I given you any reason to believe I'm not eating properly?" "Well, no. But have I missed any medications or had any accidents with the stove?" "That's not the point," David said. "The point is what could happen." "Ah," Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. "So you want to remove my autonomy, not because of anything I've done, but because of what you imagine I might do." "We want to prevent problems before they happen," Christine said. "By creating a problem that doesn't currently exist," Margaret replied. "By taking away my rights preemptively, based on your assumptions about my future decline." The kettle began to whistle, and Margaret turned off the heat, her movements calm and precise. She prepared her tea with the same careful attention she brought to all her domestic tasks, then sat down at the kitchen table across from her son and daughter-in-law. "Before you proceed with any legal action," Margaret said, "there are some things you should know." She reached for the folder she'd begun keeping on the counter, filled with the documents that now governed her affairs. "First, I've undergone a comprehensive cognitive assessment at your father's university medical center. The results show no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would affect my judgment." She handed David the first set of papers, watching his expression change as he read the detailed psychological evaluation that proclaimed Margaret Hayes to be of sound mind and fully capable of managing her own affairs. "Second, I've established a care management system that addresses all the concerns you've raised about my safety and well-being." She produced another document. "Dr. Wells visits monthly. A home health aide comes weekly to help with heavy cleaning, and I have a medical alert system that connects me to emergency services if needed." Christine snatched the papers from David's hands, scanning them quickly. "This doesn't change anything. You're still living alone, still vulnerable." "Third," Margaret continued, "I've updated my legal arrangements to ensure that any attempt to have me declared incompetent will be vigorously contested by qualified professionals who can attest to my mental and physical capabilities." The final document she handed them was a letter from Richard Morrison outlining the legal protections Margaret had put in place, including the names and credentials of the medical and psychological experts who would testify on her behalf if necessary. David read the letter twice, his face growing paler with each word. "Mom, you don't understand what you're doing. If something happens to you, if you get hurt or confused, we won't be able to help you. If something happens to me," Margaret said gently, "I have people who will help me in ways that respect my dignity and autonomy. The question is whether you want to be among those people." Christine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like we're the enemy when we're the only ones who care about you." "If you care about me," Margaret said, "then respect my choices. If you love me, then trust that I know what's best for my own life." "And if we can't do that?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at her son, this man she'd carried in her body, nursed through illnesses, cheered at soccer games, and supported through college, and felt a deep sadness settle over her. "Then, I suppose you'll have to decide what matters more to you, having a relationship with me on terms of mutual respect, or having control over me on your terms." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of relationships fracturing, of love curdling into obligation, of family bonds stretched beyond their breaking point. Finally, David stood, his movements stiff with suppressed emotion. "We'll be in touch," he said, the words carrying more threat than promise. After they left, Margaret sat in her kitchen as the afternoon light faded around her. She'd drawn her final line, made her ultimate stand. Whatever happened next would happen on her terms, with her dignity intact. For the first time in months, that felt like enough. The months that followed brought a peace Margaret hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Without the constant anxiety of family disapproval hanging over her decisions, she began to rediscover aspects of herself that had been dormant. She enrolled in a Spanish class at the community college, joined a hiking group for seniors, and began writing letters to the editor of the local newspaper about issues that mattered to her. Tyler visited every few weeks, sometimes bringing friends who were curious about the grandmother who'd refused to go gentle into that good night. As he'd poetically described her situation to them, Margaret enjoyed these visits immensely, finding the young people's energy and perspectives refreshing. They treated her as an interesting adult rather than a fragile relic, asking her opinions about everything from politics to relationships. "You're kind of famous on campus," Tyler told her during one visit. "I told my sociology professor about your situation, and she used it as a case study in ageism and family dynamics." Margaret laughed. "I'm not sure how I feel about being a case study." "You should feel proud," Tyler said seriously. "Professor Martinez says what you did takes incredible courage. Most people your age just give in to what their families want, even when it makes them miserable." Margaret felt a glow of satisfaction at this validation. "And how are your parents handling your continued visits?" Tyler's expression darkened slightly. "They're not happy about it. Dad says I'm encouraging your stubbornness, and Mom thinks you're trying to turn me against them." "Are they right?" Margaret asked gently. "About the stubbornness part, maybe," Tyler grinned. "But you're not turning me against them. They're doing that themselves by being so unreasonable." Margaret sighed. "I never wanted to cause problems between you and your parents." "You didn't cause anything," Tyler said firmly. "They created this situation by trying to control you instead of respecting you. I'm old enough to see that." The relationship with David and Christine remained frozen in hostile silence. They made no further threats about guardianship proceedings, perhaps recognizing the futility of challenging Margaret's carefully constructed legal protections, but they also made no effort to rebuild the relationship on more respectful terms. Margaret felt their absence keenly during holidays, but she adapted as she had adapted to Harold's death and all the other losses that came with aging. She hosted Tyler for Thanksgiving, inviting Dr. Wells and Richard Morrison to join them for what became a warm, intimate celebration. Christmas was spent volunteering at the homeless shelter, where Margaret's nursing skills and warm presence made her instantly popular with both staff and clients. "You're glowing," Dr. Wells observed during Margaret's quarterly checkup in February. "Whatever you're doing agrees with you." "I'm living my own life," Margaret said simply. "It's amazing how energizing that can be." Spring brought an unexpected development. Margaret was working in her garden when a car pulled into her driveway. She looked up to see a woman roughly her own age approaching, carrying a plate covered with a tea towel. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dorothy Chen. I live 3 streets over," in the blue house with the white picket fence. Margaret recognized the name, if not the face. Dorothy was the widow who'd moved to the neighborhood the previous fall, the one whose husband had been a professor at the same university where Harold had worked. Of course, Margaret said, rising and brushing soil from her gardening gloves. How nice to meet you. I brought you some cookies, Dorothy said, extending the plate, and I wanted to thank you. Thank me. For what? Dorothy smiled, her weathered face crinkling with warmth. For showing the rest of us that we don't have to disappear just because our children think we should. Margaret felt a flutter of surprise. I'm not sure I understand. My daughter has been pressuring me to move to Arizona, to live near her and her family. She says it's for my own good, that I need supervision, that I'm too old to live alone. Dorothy's voice carried a familiar note of frustration. But watching you stand your ground, seeing you build a life on your own terms, it's given me courage to do the same. Margaret invited Dorothy in for tea, and over the next hour, she learned that her situation was far from unique. Dorothy had been fighting similar battles with her well-meaning, but controlling adult children. So had several other widows in the neighborhood, women who'd been made to feel like burdens by families who confused age with incompetence. We should form a club, Dorothy said with a laugh that held only partial jest. The Stubborn Old Ladies Society, the Independent Women's Alliance, Margaret countered, and they both laughed. What started as a joke became reality within a month. Margaret and Dorothy organized a monthly gathering for women facing similar pressures from their families. The group met at the community center, ostensibly for a book club but actually for mutual support and practical advice. The women who attended came from diverse backgrounds: former teachers and nurses, businesswomen and homemakers, women who'd raised children, and women who'd chosen different paths. What united them was their shared experience of being dismissed, patronized, and pressured by people who claimed to love them but couldn't seem to respect them. My son wants me to sell my car, shared Eleanor, a retired librarian. He says my reflexes aren't what they used to be, but I passed my driving test with flying colors last month. My daughter thinks I should stop traveling, added Beatrice, who'd been planning a trip to Ireland. She says it's too dangerous for someone my age, but I've been traveling alone for 30 years. Margaret listened to these stories with a mixture of anger and recognition. Each woman's situation was unique, but the underlying theme was that some adult children who believed that reaching a certain age automatically disqualified their mothers from making their own decisions. The group developed strategies for maintaining independence, legal protections, support networks, ways to document competency, methods for having difficult conversations with family members, but more importantly, it provided validation for the revolutionary idea that women didn't have an expiration date on their right to self-determination. Word of the group spread, and within 6 months, they were meeting twice a month with a core membership of 15 women. The local newspaper did a feature story about them, which brought national attention. Margaret found herself being interviewed by reporters, invited to speak at conferences on aging, and consulted by other women facing similar challenges. You've started a movement, Tyler told her during one of his visits, showing her articles about similar groups forming in other cities. I've simply refused to disappear, Margaret replied. Apparently, that's revolutionary enough. The irony wasn't lost on her that in fighting for her right to live quietly, she'd become something of a public figure. But she embraced the role, understanding that her visibility might help other women find the courage to claim their own autonomy. The confrontation with David and Christine came to a head in late summer, prompted by a newspaper article that featured Margaret prominently. The headline read, "The Grey Revolution: Senior Women Fight Back Against Ageism," and it included a photo of Margaret speaking at a conference on elder rights. They arrived on a Sunday morning, their faces tight with embarrassment and anger. "We saw the article," David said without preamble. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked at her son with something approaching pity. "How does it make you look, David?" "Like we don't care about our mother," Christine said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Like we're trying to abuse you or control you or something, aren't you?" Margaret asked gently. "We're trying to protect you," David shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "We're trying to make sure you're safe and cared for, and you're making us look like monsters in the newspaper." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Harold's roses were blooming with spectacular abundance. She'd tended them carefully through the summer, and they'd rewarded her attention with the most beautiful display she could remember. "David, she said without turning around. What would make you happy? What outcome would satisfy you? I want you to be safe, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I want to know that you're not going to fall down the stairs or forget to take your medicine or get confused and wander off. I want to stop worrying about you every single day. Margaret turned to face him, seeing for the first time the genuine fear beneath his controlling behavior. And you think the only way to achieve that is to lock me away in an institution? It's not an institution, Christine protested automatically, but her heart wasn't in the argument anymore. What if there were another way? Margaret asked. What if I could give you the reassurance you need without giving up my independence? Over the next hour, Margaret outlined the comprehensive support system she'd built: the monthly medical checkups, the weekly cleaning help, the medical alert system, the network of friends who looked out for each other. She showed them the detailed emergency plans she'd developed, the legal documents that ensured she'd receive appropriate care if her condition changed, the financial arrangements that would fund whatever assistance she might need. I've thought about every scenario you've mentioned, Margaret said. I've planned for contingencies, established safeguards, and created multiple layers of support. What I haven't done is surrender my right to make my own choices. David studied the documents with the careful attention of someone looking for flaws, but gradually his expression shifted from skepticism to grudging admiration. This is comprehensive, he admitted. I may be 72, Margaret said, but I'm not stupid. I understand the realities of aging, and I've prepared for them. What I won't do is surrender to them prematurely. Christine remained silent throughout this exchange, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. What about us? She asked. What about your family? Do we just, exist on the periphery of your life now? Margaret felt a stab of sympathy for this woman who'd become her adversary. That depends on you, Christine. I'd love to have a relationship with you and David, but it has to be based on mutual respect. I can't be the compliant old lady you can manage and control, but I can be the competent adult who makes her own decisions and takes responsibility for the consequences. The conversation didn't resolve everything, but it marked the beginning of a slow thaw in their relationship. David and Christine didn't immediately transform into the supportive family members Margaret wished for, but they stopped actively undermining her independence. They began to visit regularly again, treating these occasions as social calls rather than intervention attempts. The breakthrough came 6 months later, when Margaret slipped on ice while walking to her car and broke her wrist. Tyler, acting as her emergency contact, managed the crisis with efficiency and maturity that impressed even his parents. Margaret's support network swung into action. Dr. Wells provided medical care. Dorothy organized meal delivery. The cleaning service increased their visits, and Richard handled the insurance paperwork. Within a week, Margaret was back to her normal routine with only minor adjustments for her injury. She'd proven that her independence didn't mean isolation, that preparing for vulnerability was different from surrendering to it. I have to admit, David said during a visit after her cast was removed, you handled that crisis better than I would have. I had help, Margaret said. Good help from people who respect my judgment. Point taken, David said with a rueful smile. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you, Mom. I don't always understand you, and I still worry about you, but I'm proud of the woman you've become. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. I've always been this woman, David. You just needed to learn how to see her. 2 years later, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing dinner for a celebration. At 74, she moved with the same purposeful energy that had characterized her younger years, though she'd learned to pace herself and accept help when it made sense. The house around her hummed with life and activity. Dorothy was setting the table, Tyler was arranging flowers from the garden, and Dr. Wells was opening wine for the dinner guests. The occasion was the 2nd anniversary of the Independent Women's Alliance, which had grown from their small neighborhood group into a regional organization with chapters in 12 cities. Margaret had been invited to speak at their national conference the following month, an opportunity that both thrilled and amused her. I never imagined I'd become an activist in my 70s, she told Dorothy as they prepared the final touches for dinner. You didn't become anything, Dorothy replied with a smile. You just stopped hiding who you always were. The dinner guests began arriving as the sun set through Margaret's lace curtains. Eleanor brought her grandson, a young man studying who was writing his thesis on ageism in family dynamics. Beatrice arrived fresh from her trip to Scotland. full of stories and photos. Dr. Wells brought her partner, a retired teacher who'd become an enthusiastic supporter of the Alliance's educational programs. The surprise guest was David, who arrived with Christine and a bouquet of roses from his own garden cuttings, from the bushes Harold had planted years before. "I thought you might like to know," David said as he handed Margaret the flowers, "that Christine and I have been talking to her parents about some of the things we learned from our disagreements with you." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, they were being pressured by Christine's brother to move to a retirement community," David explained. "We helped them explore alternatives that would let them stay in their own home." Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction. "How did that work out?" "They're thriving," Christine said, speaking directly to Margaret for the first time in months. "And they keep telling people about this amazing woman who showed them it was possible to age on their own terms." As the evening progressed, Margaret looked around her dining room table at the faces gathered there, young and old, family and chosen family, people connected by respect rather than obligation. Tyler was deep in conversation with El's grandson about social work careers. Dr. Wells and Beatrice were planning a medical mission trip to Central America. Dorothy and Christine were discovering a shared love of historical novels. This was the life Margaret had fought for, not a life free from challenges or change, but a life lived on her own terms with dignity and tact. She'd learned that independence didn't mean isolation, that accepting help didn't require surrendering autonomy, and that love could coexist with boundaries. After the guests left and the dishes were cleared, Margaret sat in her living room with Tyler, who'd volunteered to help with cleanup and had ended up staying for a late-night conversation. "Grandma," Tyler said, settling into the chair that had been Harold's favorite, "I have to ask you something." "Of course, sweetheart. Do you ever regret it? Standing up to Mom and Dad the way you did? It caused a lot of pain for everyone." Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain," she said finally. "I regret that it took a crisis to establish boundaries that should have existed all along. But I don't regret claiming my right to live my own life, even if it meant risking your relationship with them." "Tyler, what kind of relationship would it have been if it required me to surrender my autonomy to maintain it? Love that demands the destruction of self isn't love, it's something else entirely." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand. It's like you had to save yourself before you could save the relationship." "Something like that," Margaret agreed, "though I prefer to think of it as being honest about what I needed rather than trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of Margaret's house settling around them. Finally, Tyler spoke again. "I hope I have your courage when I'm your age." Margaret smiled. "You already have it, sweetheart. You just haven't needed to use it yet." As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The journey from Harold's funeral to this evening had been marked by loss and conflict, but also by discovery and growth. She'd learned that aging didn't have to mean diminishment, that respect was something to be demanded rather than hoped for, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for your family was to refuse to enable their worst impulses. The house around her held 40 years of memories, but it also held promise for whatever years remained. Margaret had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead. She knew that age would eventually bring limitations and dependencies she couldn't foresee, but she also knew that she'd face those challenges with the same clarity and dignity that had carried her through this transformation. She'd proven to herself and to anyone who cared to notice that 74 was not a disqualification from living fully. And if that seemed revolutionary to some people, well, perhaps it was time for a revolution. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. She was, after all, still writing her own story.